All right, I've officially started chapter 5 in Fire in California's Ecosystems, and I think this next chapter might be the best one of the book. It's called Fire as an Ecological Process. The chapter I just read was Fire as a Physical Process, went into all the physics of wildfire in California. This next one's going to be talking, I believe, more about fire within ecosystems and how it is an ecological process. Now, I read the introduction in chapter 5, and I think it ties in well with what I was talking about yesterday. And yesterday's podcast or video, however you're watching this, went about 50 minutes. And I don't imagine most people are going to listen to a 50-minute talk about a wildfire textbook, unless you're maybe very into wildfire. So I'll just try to briefly summarize what I talked about yesterday and then see if I can tie that into what I believe we'll be learning about within this next chapter coming up. So yesterday, the main idea I was putting forward was actually more of a question than an idea. I looked up the stats of how our wildfire season has been, and everyone in California knows it's been a pretty quiet wildfire year. I usually do maybe 2 to 3 wildfire forecasts a day for maybe months on a time throughout wildfire season. And this year I've maybe done 5 to 10 wildfire forecasts total, because I usually only do it on the days that seem extreme or seem like a risk to life and property. And there just haven't been many of those days, which even right there I was about to say, which is a good thing. And that obviously is a good thing. But if you just look at it on a numbers basis, like I did yesterday, I looked up the numbers, and our 5-year average of acres burned in California is 1.5 million acres. This year, 2023, we've burned 317,000 acres. So just right off the bat, you'd see those numbers and you'd say, oh, this was a good wildfire year in California. But the question I was putting forward yesterday, and you can listen to the whole podcast if you want to, but the question I was putting forward is that actually a good thing that we didn't burn many acres this year? Because I provide some evidence through research, and I think most Californians just intuitively know this, that wildfire is just going to get worse in the future because things are going to get hotter and drier. And there's going to be more people moving into the wildland-urban interface, which leads to more ignitions. And then most likely we're just going to continue to see fuels accumulate even more. And those were a lot of the things that we learned about in Chapter 4. It was almost like every single aspect of wildfire, diving into the physics of it that we learned, whether you're talking about how does combustion occur, or how do fuels impact wildfire, and how dry fuels lead to more extreme wildfire. Slope isn't really a thing that's going to change, but obviously slope and wind can lead to faster wildfire spread. But then we talked about different types of fire. You have ground fire, surface fire, crown fire. You have spotting, plant mortality, scorching, all these different vocab words. Biomass consumption. And within each of those new maybe vocab terms that we learned about in Chapter 4, it seems like we were either not going to see changes in the future, or those factors would be moving in the wrong direction. Basically, wildfire will be getting worse in the future, especially when you think about things like how easy it is for combustion to occur. Most likely we're going to have more fuels. Those fuels are going to be drier. Those fuels are going to be hotter, which means it's easier for them to combust. They're closer to their ignition temperature. With more fuels, it would make crown fire more likely. And even if we had the same amount of fuels, as long as it gets hotter and drier, that alone would make crown fires more likely. And then spotting would also become more likely as well, because a big part of that is how dry the fuels are, both in how hot the fire is for how much rising motion you're going to have to pick those embers up, and then how likely it is that one of those burning embers leads to an ignition. Big part of that is how dry the fuels are. And in the future, fuels are going to be drier. So that was a long-winded way, although a short-winded way of compared to yesterday, of basically just saying wildfire is most likely going to get worse in the future based on a lot of the physics behind wildfire, because it looks like we are going to be getting hotter and drier, and my own research has showed that. So then the question would be, we didn't burn many acres this year, but for every acre that didn't burn this year, the fuels on that land are just going to continue to grow, continue to accumulate, and because fire is a natural part of the California ecosystem, eventually that acre or that area of land is going to burn. Now, what's a bit alarming about that is, would you rather have an acre burned today and have an acre burned today and it's maybe a moderate fire, or maybe it's even an extreme fire, or you wait 20 years where there's even more fuel and then all those fuels are warmer and drier, and then you have an even more extreme wildfire that is an even greater risk to life and property. So it's not really a matter of if something is going to burn in California, but when. And kind of, it seems like what's happening right now is our mindset, and even my own mindset, is towards, we didn't have a lot of fire right now, that's good. But in reality, that just means we're kind of kicking the can down the road, and we're more likely to have extreme wildfire in the future because we didn't clear out some of those fuels today. So luckily, there does seem to be a path out of this, and it looks like we're already kind of going down this path. We could have the best of both worlds. We could have this idea where we use some of the advanced technology we have, like AI cameras being able to spot exactly when a fire starts, and then some of our new model simulation technology, which will show how the fire is going to spread throughout the day today, based on your temperature, fuel, relative humidity, slope, how the fire creates its own weather. We run this model out of San Jose State's Fire Weather Research Laboratory, although technically now it's called the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center, because we brought in a lot of other different fields that impact wildfire, or that are related to wildfire. So we could take this technology and we could use it to our advantage. We could see, okay, a fire just started, and then maybe instead of just saying, put it out as fast as possible, we run the model simulation and we see how it's going to burn throughout the day today. And if it seems like it's actually going to provide a net benefit to the ecosystem by clearing out some of the fuels, which is better to do now than to have them accumulate and just have them burn in a hotter, drier environment in the future where it's going to be more extreme. As long as it's not a threat to life and property, and our model shows it, and the models are pretty good right now, then we could just let it burn. And then maybe we run the model and it shows that, it's actually going to take off to the north and it could take out this community. Then we use these advanced tools that we have to put the fire out as quickly as possible. But we could start using this technology, and we probably already are, to decide when we actually will allow wildfires to burn instead of just instantly putting them out, throwing millions of dollars on them, when in reality, we would maybe pay millions of dollars for the natural benefits that fire would have to the ecosystem. If you imagine how expensive it is to do all the permitting, do some maybe prescribed burning, or have crews go in with chainsaws and chippers, you could probably, for a large enough area of land, I'm sure the price tag of that could go into the millions of dollars. So it's interesting that we do have some fires in California where it's not that hot out, not that dry out, not that windy out. It's not going to be one of those extreme wildfire days. Maybe it's going to rain the next day. So even if it started to grow a bunch today, well, then the rain tomorrow is probably going to significantly decrease the behavior tomorrow. So it's interesting that we would spend millions of dollars to put out a fire that could be beneficial, when in reality we might be willing to pay millions of dollars for the exact thing that fire would do. So I think the vision for the future there would just be using our technology to our advantage, But the main thing that needs to switch in our mindset is that fire is always the enemy and that we should always put it out as fast as possible. When in reality, fire is most likely the best tool that we have to clear out some of the fuels in California right now so that there's less fuel in the future when things are hotter, drier, and more extreme. And this is all just to maximize personal safety, the protection of our property, and life in California as well. Now that's from a very human perspective, but I imagine what we're going to be getting into in this next chapter in Fire in California's ecosystems is the entire ecosystem perspective. Because fire has been a part of California's ecosystem for thousands of years, and there's been some major disruptions within the last maybe 2 centuries, but a lot of the plants in California have evolved with wildfire. So, for example, chamise in the chaparral. This is one of my favorite examples. It has a burl underneath the ground that's almost like a reserve of resources, and then the seeds from chamise will just turn into what you call a seed bank, where they just sit in the soil and it just continues to build up and build up and build up for years, if not maybe even decades. And then a fire comes through, it burns out what appears to be the entire area in the chaparral. It looks like all the chamise has burned out. But in reality, this is actually just the perfect time for some new growth to occur. So the fire pops open those seeds somehow, and then the seeds start to sprout, while simultaneously the plant that we thought was destroyed is actually still alive underneath the ground in the form of that burl, or the reserve of its resources, and then that resprouts as well. And then as long as you have enough time between fires, then you just have another chamise plant pop up, or the same one that was there before resprouting out of its burl. And then it's just a natural evolution. And the reason I say you have to have a certain amount of time between those fires is because if you have it too frequently, then the seeds don't have time to build up a large enough bank. And then also the burl has already used up its resources and it needs to kind of save or just build up its resources again. I was trying to use some kind of banking metaphor right there. Build up its savings. But what's interesting is in this example, so talking about the chaparral, it's not just the plants, it's also the animals that rely on these plants as well. They like the seeds, and an ideal chaparral environment is actually one where there's patches of different fire history. Maybe there's one area that burned in the last year, maybe there's one little patch that burned 5 years ago, one where it's 10 years ago, and then one that's very mature chaparral that maybe hasn't burned in 50 years. And you have all these different patches, and each one of those patches actually favors different animals. And then as you have new fires, or you have the maturing of different parts of the chaparral, you have this migration of the animals to the ecosystem that favors them best. For example, I believe I remember hearing deer love it when there's a mature chaparral next to an area that just burned, because the deer can go in there and eat some of the new sprouts that are coming up, but then the mature chaparral can provide them with some easy cover to get away from predators. So that's one example. Another one would be like the giant sequoias up in the Sierra. So the giant sequoias have fire-resistant bark, and they engage in self-pruning, which is their lower branches fall off, so that if surface fires come through, it can clear out a lot of the fuels around them, but then the giant sequoia is completely fine. And the giant sequoias have actually not only learned to live with fire, but actually benefit from fire, because the fire clears out all their competition, and then just like the chamise plants, their seeds or their cones kind of pop open and their seeds germinate after the fires come through, cleared out the competing vegetation, and then those new sprouts are in just a perfect environment to be able to take off and make it to maturity. Now, what can interrupt that is if we don't allow any fire to happen, And then what happens is the fuels accumulate so much that when a fire finally does come through, it's so extreme that it overwhelms the giant sequoia's natural defenses. And then the amazing giant sequoia that would have been fine with some surface fire in the past is now destroyed because you have some huge, extreme, maybe even crown fire come through because of this fuel accumulation. So I think that right there is just a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where fire is actually good for the ecosystem because it's part of the ecosystem. And I believe that's what this next chapter is really going to be diving into in Fire in California's ecosystems is, what makes the different plant ecosystems. Like in some parts of California, we have grasslands, and then along the coast, we have coastal scrub, and then in some parts of the Central Coast, we have chaparral, and then up in the mountains, we have some giant sequoias, or you go really high up, maybe it's some pines. And the reason that we have these different plant communities and the animals live in certain plant communities based on what they're adapted to as well. The reason we have that is because those plants have naturally evolved for that specific niche, you could say. And that's going to be based on lots of things. The elevation, type of soil, how much moisture is in the soil, how much rainfall that area gets per year, how hot it's going to be, how much moisture is going to be in the air. All of these different factors stemming from geology to meteorology to maybe even you could throw oceanography in there somehow, geomorphology, ecology. It's all mixed together to lead to these very diverse ecosystems. But what's most interesting is that fire is actually part of that process. Just like you'd say, oh, the redwood trees in the Santa Cruz Mountains, kind of like a more shaded, moist environment. Well, they also like fire, you could say it that way. Or like the giant sequoias. Just like the giant sequoias like a more shaded, moist environment, it also likes fire. So the point I'm trying to make there is that it's not like our plant systems or communities evolve based on the soil type, temperature, humidity, precipitation, and then fire is a disturbance that destroys the plant community and it's a bad thing. Fire is actually just like one of those other factors. Fire is like temperature or precipitation in California. And again, there is going to be different nuances here where it depends on which different bioregion you're talking about. What's true for the Sierra is different for what's true for the chaparral, and that's going to be different in different parts of California. So it's all very localized. But the key point that I'm trying to put forward is that fire is a part of the California ecosystem. So in order for the California ecosystem to be more natural and for humans to kind of live in balance with nature, which is, I think, something that most people would agree we want to do, then we need to learn how to incorporate fire back into the ecosystem. So it's no longer a war against fire, but it's figuring out, okay, this is a day where the fire is going to be extreme. Let's put it out as fast as possible. But then sometimes deciding, you know what, this is a day where the fire may actually be beneficial. Let's allow it to do its thing. And then maybe in a year where you burn 317,000 acres instead of 1.5 million acres, which is the average, then you just really take advantage of those days where maybe it's not that hot, not that dry, not that windy. It's very low chance that you're going to have an extreme wildfire. And actually, my master's thesis, the model I built, can predict when you're going to have an extreme wildfire with a pretty good degree of accuracy. So we could just take advantage of the days that are going to lead to moderate fire behavior and try to burn as many acres as possible now, as opposed to waiting to the future when it's going to be hotter and drier and more extreme. So it's maybe doing what's harder right now, sacrificing a little bit right now, but for what's best in the long run, not only for our future selves, but for future generations and for the California ecosystem in general. So can't wait to read this next chapter. If you want to learn more about fire as an ecological process, as I go through this chapter, I'll be doing these videos every day. And thanks for watching.